Okay, folks, we're going to finish up chapter 11, and we're going to consider the second and third parts of this. The second is the Hiberno-Saxon and the Carolingian, and the third is the Ottonian. So with the Hiberno-Saxon and Carolingian, is we're going to still see abstract interlaces like we saw with the first group with the Merovingian and the Anglo-Saxon, but we're going to see a slow lessening of animal figures. Okay, so we're going to still see the patterns of the abstract interlaces, but we're going to slowly remove the use of animal figures as we move more towards more orthodox Christian themes that are going to spread from the the Constantinian and the Byzantium areas and time frames after the fall of the Roman Empire, and it's going to start to find its way up into Europe and make its way all the way up into the Vikings and the Merovingian and Anglo-Saxons, like we saw with the Viking staff church in earnest, and it's also going to spread into this Hiberno-Saxon and Carolingian period. All right, and the first piece that I want to show you are some manuscripts, and we're going to look at the the cross inscribed carpet page, the folio 26 verso of the Lindisfarne Gospels, and this is going to be in England, and it's going to be figure 11:7. And what this is, let me just break it down for you, is a marriage of Christian imagery and that abstract interlace. And it's from the Book of Durrow. And the Book of Durrow, an image of that is 11:6, all right, whenever it comes to a figurative piece like St. Matthew. And you can still see the abstracted interlaces bordering around St. Matthew, but it's still that very flat and representational kind of figurative design that we would see in late antiquity, also in the Byzantine period. And you can see that present here in figure 11:6. So that's making its way from the Christian themes, okay? And then it continues with the Christian themes in regards to figure 11:7, which is the cross inscribed carpet page. And with this, we see lots of abstract interlaces, right? But it is actually animals. So when you zoom in, you will see that on the outside areas of the cross, it's going to be these animals that are interwoven, that are devouring each other and curling over one another and then returning to themselves. So that's going to be on the outer perimeter, not the perimeter, but the outer contour of that red line that makes up the cross shape. And it's almost hypnotic. It has a lot of motion to it. It's very kinetic visually. Okay, and of course let me read a couple more things here. The contour of the cross grounds the pattern. Okay, so the red, which is the contour of the cross, grounds the pattern. And it's kind of this sense of immobility found in this chaotic world that's around it. So the cross itself is supposed to represent this element of order and control, with these more symmetrical patterns within the red contour. And outside of that red contour is some element of symmetry, but it's also very chaotic, and it's this kind of more abstract animal world. So this element of immobility kind of brought down by this sense of animal-like abstracted interlaced motion that's happening around it. So almost like there's this place of this sacred place in which you can go to, which is found within the cross, and then the outside external world around it is a little more chaotic. But again, figure 11:7 is that coupling between those two primary styles we talked about, with the abstract lace interlacing as well as the animals being present. And now we're starting to see the Orthodox Christian themes coming out through it. Okay. There's another example that's very similar to this that you should be able to notice similarities, and that's figure 11:9. It's the high cross of Muirtach in Ireland. Okay, and it has the abstract patterns which actually become figures. All right, and with again Christian narratives, and the Christian narratives in specific with figure 11:9 is the crucifixion and the Last Judgment. All right, so the figures are actually built up and clustered in a way to create this element of patternization. So it looks almost abstract in nature, and it has this series of registrations, right, like we saw with some of the mosaics during late antiquity and into the Byzantine time. So that whole element of registration was starting to come back, which is something that went away during the Greek and the Roman period, and then it came back after the end of the Roman period, after it had separated from east to west in late antiquity. That was derivative of Constantine's move from polytheism to monotheism. So those registrations or those registers are starting to come back all the way back from those ancient Mesopotamian times. But the figures themselves in this case are not animal, but they're humans, because it is that Orthodox Christian narrative that is showing these biblical parables and narratives. And they are the ones, those human figures, that are making up the patterns, and not the animals in this case. But we do still have interlacing patterns that are happening with the clustering of the people within these narratives of the crucifixion and the Last Judgment. All right, and now let's talk about the Carolingian period. This is actually called a Renaissance period. So it's the Carolingian Renaissance. And the Carolingian, again, is Carolingin. And it's a Renaissance, which means it's a rebirth. And what it is, it's a rebirth of the Roman emperorship. Okay, so we're going to see two different Renaissance. We're going to talk about two different Renaissances. In this case, it's the rebirth of the Roman emperorship. And then later on, we'll talk about the move into the Renaissance, the Proto-Renaissance, which will be the rebirth of antiquity coming from the Greek and Roman period. And that actually is Art History 142 for any of you that are interested in taking that course. But in this case, it's a Carolingian Renaissance, and Renaissance is Renaissance, Renaissance. And it literally just means like the rebirth, the revitalization. And it's going to be of the Roman emperorship in the West under Charlemagne. Okay, and it's going to be considered the Holy Roman Empire. And it's going to be a combination of Christian themes and Roman styles. So some of the Roman styles that we originally saw during the chapter 7, I believe, the Roman art, is going to start to be reinvented and reused. Okay, and the first is actually the figure 1112. This is an equestrian portrait of Charlemagne. And if you remember looking back at the high Roman art period, or high Roman Empire period, we had a equestrian sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. And you should be able to compare figure 1112 here with Charlemagne or Charles the Bald from France of this equestrian portrait of figure 1112, to be able to relate it to that Marcus Aurelius that we saw all the way back in chapter 7, because it's very derivative of that style. It's even made out of bronze, like what we saw with Marcus Aurelius in chapter 7. All right, and what this is Charlemagne, he brought in the best artists from Europe and the Byzantinum. So remember, in the Byzantine chapter, I talked about how the artists made their way west, back into the Western Roman Empire, but then that fell, and then this is what's happening after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and this Carolingian period, and this kingdom of the Carolingian is something that's derivative of the Roman Empire. But what they want to do with Charlemagne is try to revitalize this Roman spirit. So he's going to bring all the best artists in, and he's really going to focus on some of the old techniques that the Romans used, which were derivative of the Greeks. And if you see in figure 1112, you have a sense of proportion, even though he's much larger than the horse, but that's something they did with Marcus Aurelius to kind of give him that larger and more pompous-like presence that they did with the emperors of Rome. You do see also the use of the organic drapery slightly used on the body. Again, that's something that was very particular to the Romans and the Greeks. And he's holding an orb, which shows his dominance, a world dominance. By holding an orb was a symbol that the Romans used to show that sense of dominance. He does have a crown that's very reflective of a king that does worship in Christianity, so there is that element to it. but his eyes are also casted forward and a slightly up, which means that he is looking beyond just the purview of the material world. He's looking into more of the heavenly realm. So again, that is an indicator of that Roman emperorship that we saw, that was kind of ascribed upon the Roman emperors as if they were divine earthly kings. The horse symbolizes conquest, the orb, world dominion, and again, be able to relate this to Marcus Aurelius on the horse, and also look at the Byzantine chapter whenever we're looking at, I think it's chapter 9, right? And we're looking at what Justinian would use whenever he was holding an orb in his hand with one of those relief carvings that we saw at the very beginning of early Byzantine period. Okay, and now, let me see how we're doing on time. Doing okay. Now we're going to jump down to St. Matthew of the Coronation Gospel. All right. So let me move down to that slide. And that's figure 1113. All right. And so in this case, I want you to really see the use of the paintings and how they were used in these gospel books. Okay. And in this case, it's the gospel book of Charlemagne. You can see that he's bringing back that halo effect, right? Something that the Byzantine icon painters would use, right? They would use those golden effulgent halos, and in this case, it's being placed upon St. Matthew. He has some worn and torn and kind of tattered like surface, but his halo itself, as well as the facial features, are showing that depth and detail and that sense of perspective, which is something that the Romans used and really cherished and loved, was that horizontal perspective. It's something that was lost in late antiquity as well as into the Byzantine period, but then it started to come back towards the Middle Ages, and this again is early medieval Europe art. So we're starting to see that sense of depth and detail coming back with figure 1113, St. Matthew, folio 15. And Charlemagne was the one who was the harbinger of this, so he loved the arts and he brought them back. And he used these new artistic styles that were coming from the Byzantine area, and he really infused them in the manuscript and the paintings that we see here, for example, with St. Matthew from the Coronation Gospels, the Gospel Book of Charlemagne. All right, so he really brought it back. And there is not much line. There's a lot of use of brushwork. So except for the halo itself, there's not a lot of direct contour lines. They're all blended lines, okay, which are called implied lines. And that's something that's going to become very important in Europe and during the Renaissance. Several hundred years, well, almost, let's see, 600 years after this. It's the whole idea of the blurred line is going to be a really big deal in Northern Europe. Using oil paints. So this is kind of the advent of that, the beginnings of that, the precursor. And we call it brushwork painting instead of linear painting. And so figure 1113 is a good example of that. All right. And some of the main Roman elements of this, so obviously the Christian elements are with St. Matthew and the writing of the Gospels and the manuscript and the halo itself. And the main Roman themes that we see are the cross-legged chair, which actually was something that was used for the higher intellectuals in the Roman period, is placed here, and St. Matthew is sitting upon it. Also, the use of the toga, which is what he's wearing, was very much a Roman style. And even the lectern itself, which is showing that element of perspective, is something that was very Roman. So again, Charlemagne, during this Carolingian period, is trying to bring back some of this Roman style and coupling it with these Christian themes. Okay, so now let's conclude with the use or the discussion of the Ottonian, right? And with the Ottonian, what I want to talk about is it was the divided Carolingian Empire. So what we're just now discussing with Charlemagne was divided, and it was divided into three. And all of them collapse with Vikings from the west, either collapse from Vikings from the west, the Magyars from the east, and the Sarkis are the Muslims in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so that's kind of how it all collapsed. And the eastern part reunified into the Ottonians. Okay, so what Charlemagne had is the Carolingian Empire broke down into three, and then it collapsed, and then it reunified to the eastern sections in the Ottonians. And the church was also corrupted at this time, but the Ottonians reformed it. Okay, and what I want you to look at during this Ottonian time in particular is St. Michael's. So let's take a look at St. Michael's. And you can see that in figure, oh, wait a second, let me see. St. Michael's. I tell you what, folks, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave this video a little short, and then I'll do a quick little small video later this week in regards, or in the next day in regards to the St. Michael's. All right?